A quiet town, a predictable man, a life lived entirely by routine. When he disappeared, nothing looked wrong. His wallet, his keys, all left behind. But his phone moved. One message, no name, no explanation, just a time and a place. He walked in knowing someone was waiting. He just didn't know why. Murder Book 360. Disclaimer: this program contains graphic descriptions of real crimes. Viewer discretion is advised. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. In a place where nothing ever seems to happen. A quiet town, the kind where the rhythm of life is predictable, almost rehearsed. Streets lined with modest homes, each one carrying the quiet routines of ordinary people. Early mornings marked by the hum of distant traffic, evenings softened by porch lights flickering on one by one. It is the kind of place where neighbors recognize each other not by name, but by habit, where absence is noticed, eventually, but not immediately. And that delay, those unnoticed minutes, those unaccounted hours, is where this case begins to unravel. It was late autumn when the disappearance was first reported. The air had begun to thin with the approaching cold, and the days were growing shorter, compressing daylight into something fleeting and fragile. On the surface, nothing about that particular evening stood out. No reports of disturbance, no signs of conflict, no witnesses who would later say, "I knew something was wrong," because nothing looked wrong. The subject of this case, a man in his early 30s, was known for consistency. He followed routines not out of necessity, but preference. He worked predictable hours, frequented the same places, and maintained a small, controlled social circle. To those who knew him, he was dependable, perhaps even rigid. Which is why when he failed to show up for work the next morning, it was not immediately treated as alarming. People are late sometimes, they oversleep, they forget. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. His phone rang unanswered, messages went unread, and by late afternoon, concern shifted into something heavier, something harder to explain.
Quarterly figures show a consistent uptick.
When authorities first entered his home, they expected to find something simple, a clear explanation.
Understood.
Maybe he had left in a hurry. Maybe there had been an emergency. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. Nothing. The house was intact, undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Everything was precisely where it should be. The kitchen was clean, the living room undisturbed, even the bed remained made, its surface untouched as though the night had passed without interruption. But there were details, small ones, that didn't fit. His keys were still inside. His wallet remained on the table, and his phone was missing.
No, nothing.
At first, that detail seemed insignificant. People take their phones everywhere. It would have been stranger if he had left it behind. But as investigators would later realize, the absence of the phone would become one of the most important and most troubling elements of the entire case. Because it was the only thing that suggested he hadn't simply vanished. It suggested movement. A timeline began to form, slowly and carefully, built from fragments of digital activity and scattered witness accounts. The last confirmed sighting placed him leaving a local store just before dusk. Surveillance footage captured him walking to his car, alone, with nothing unusual in his demeanor, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was about to go wrong. But after that moment, the trail begins to fracture. Traffic cameras failed to capture his vehicle along its usual route home. No neighbors reported seeing him return. And yet, his car was later found less than a mile from his house. It was positioned neatly, intentionally, not abandoned in haste, but left with care, as though whoever parked it had every reason to believe it would remain undisturbed. Inside, investigators found no signs of struggle, no fingerprints other than his own, no clues that suggested a second person had been present. But there was something else. The driver's seat had been adjusted. Not dramatically, but enough that someone else may have been behind the wheel. At this point, the case begins to shift. because what initially appeared to be a simple disappearance now introduces a new question. If he did not drive the car to that location himself, then who did? And more importantly, why? The timeline tightens as investigators turn to his phone records. The last signal from his device placed it near the same area where the car was discovered, but unlike the car, the phone did not remain there. It moved, briefly. Then it went dark. That movement, lasting less than 20 minutes, would become one of the most analyzed segments of the entire investigation. A narrow window where something happened, something significant enough to alter the course of events, but subtle enough to leave almost no trace behind. Witnesses in the area reported nothing unusual. No disturbances, no sounds, no figures moving through the darkness. It was as if whatever occurred quietly, deliberately, and without resistance. As days turned into weeks, the absence began to take on weight. Not just the physical absence of a person, but the absence of explanation. The kind that lingers, that resists resolution, that refuses to settle into a single narrative. Search efforts expanded outward, combing through nearby wooded areas, abandoned structures, and stretches of road that seemed, at first glance, irrelevant. Investigators followed every lead, no matter how small, but each one seemed to dissolve under closer inspection. There were no financial irregularities, no sudden withdrawals, no signs of planning or intent to leave. No farewell, no trace. And yet, the deeper the investigation went, the more the case began to change, because new details started to emerge, not from the night he disappeared, but from the days leading up to it. Subtle changes in behavior, conversations that at the time seemed ordinary, but now carried a different weight. A coworker would later recall a brief exchange, something about him seeming distracted, not anxious, not afraid, just distant, as though his attention was fixed on something he hadn't shared. Another acquaintance mentioned a canceled plan, last minute, no explanation. Individually, these details meant very little, but together they began to form a pattern, a quiet shift. And then there was the message. It wasn't discovered immediately. In fact, it was overlooked during the initial review of his digital activity. Buried among routine communications, it appeared insignificant, easy to dismiss. But once it was examined more closely, it introduced a new and deeply unsettling possibility. The message contained no explicit threat, no direct reference to danger, just a time and a place, sent the night he disappeared. No response was ever recorded, no confirmation that he saw it. But the location referenced in that message was less than half a mile from where his car was found, and suddenly the case takes on a different shape, because this was no longer just a disappearance, it was an encounter, planned or at the very least anticipated, and if he went there willingly, then the question becomes far more complex. What did he expect to find, and who was waiting for him? Investigators returned to the area with renewed focus, re-examining terrain that had already been searched, but this time they were looking for something specific, not just evidence of presence, but evidence of interaction, of meeting, of intention. And what they found was not what they expected, because hidden within that quiet stretch of land just beyond the main road, there were signs, faint, almost imperceptible, that someone else had been there. Not recently, but not long ago either. And those signs would begin to suggest that this disappearance was not as spontaneous as it first appeared. It was something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before that autumn evening. And as investigators began to follow this new direction, the case would only grow more complicated, more layered, and far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated, because every answer uncovered seemed to introduce two new questions, and every minute that passed without resolution made the truth feel just a little further out of reach. The ground itself did not appear disturbed in any obvious way. There were no deep impressions, no clear footprints preserved in the soil, no discarded items that could be immediately tied to a moment of struggle or confrontation. At first glance, the area felt almost
We must
untouched.
analyze the motivations.
Another quiet,
Curiosity may
unremarkable
initiate action,
stretch
but
of
fear
land
can sustain it.
blending into the
Confidence
surrounding
is the key
environment.
variable.
But investigations
This
of this
framework
kind
applies to the
are
unanswerable.
rarely about what is obvious. They are about what doesn't quite belong. And here, something didn't. It began with spacing, subtle irregularities in the natural pattern of the terrain, small breaks in the undergrowth, slight compressions in the grass that did not follow any clear path. These were not the kinds of
remember
disturbances left by
He came back
casual
to the office late
passers-by.
that night.
They were
He
deliberate,
seemed
though
anxious and
not
was carrying a
recent.
folder.
Time had already begun
He said
to
it was
soften
nothing,
their
but he looked
edges,
worried.
blurring their definition,
He asked me if
making
I'd
them
seen
easy to
anything unusual
overlook
that night.
unless you were specifically searching for them. The location described in the message was not a place people typically visited.
coworker's statement
It
shows a
sat
pattern.
just far enough from the road to discourage attention,
not random.
yet close enough to be
Right.
accessed
The late
without
stays and
difficulty.
file access
A
line up.
meeting point
the
chosen
hesitation
not
was
by
key.
accident, but with intent. It suggested familiarity, either with the area itself or with the idea of remaining unseen. Investigators began
Observe
to
the
consider,
minimalism.
quietly
The message is
at
deliberately
first,
sparse.
that this may
The white
not have
space
been
here
a
amplifies the
spontaneous
absence of
encounter.
context.
There was a growing
This
sense
exclusion
that
is not
whatever
oversight,
happened
it is
here
design.
had been anticipated
Look
by
at the
at least
structure.
one of the
It's not just the
individuals
words, but the
involved.
form.
The
Possibly
indentation
both.
suggests a hierarchy, a demand.
The timeline
Exactly. It
narrowed
assumes
further
compliance.
when
That's its true
analysts
message.
So, the
re-examined
sender
the phone
expects
data,
obedience.
focusing not only on where the device traveled, but how it moved. Its path was not erratic.
The
It did
untraceable
not
number isn't a
suggest
dead end.
panic or
It's
confusion.
evidence of planning.
Instead, it followed a short, consistent trajectory, one that aligned almost perfectly with the distance between the parked car and the meeting location. That kind of movement implies purpose, but then it stops, abruptly, as though whatever occurred at that point did not allow for continuation.
The fragment connects
The absence
directly,
of further
no longer an
signal was
anomaly.
not unusual in itself.
Look at the full architecture.
Devices are turned
Every
off,
element is linked.
batteries die.
The complete
But in this
framework, the design is
context, it
deliberate.
became significant, because up until that moment, everything about the case suggested control, deliberation, even calm. And then suddenly, there is nothing. Investigators began to map out the final known movements in greater detail, layering environmental factors over the existing timeline. Light conditions, temperature, visibility, each variable examined not in isolation, but in relation to human behavior. It was nearing full dark when he would have arrived. Visibility would have been limited, particularly away from the road. Anyone waiting there would have been difficult to see until it was too late to turn back.
Notice the circled time and place.
Did he expect
The
someone
real
he
insight
trusted,
lies in the marked
or
absences.
did he go there knowing he might
This
not?
positions the message uniquely.
The answer is
between
not
informality
immediately
and
clear,
formal distance.
but the distinction matters, because voluntary presence does not always imply comfort. People walk into uncertain situations for many reasons: curiosity, obligation, fear, even misplaced confidence. And in cases like this, those motivations often remain hidden long after the physical evidence has faded. What complicates matters further is what investigators did not find. There were no signs of prolonged activity in the area, no evidence suggesting that anyone remained there for an extended period of time. Whatever happened, it appears to have occurred quickly, efficiently, without the kind of chaos that leaves behind obvious traces. And yet, there is one detail, small, almost insignificant, that begins to shift the entire direction of the case. Near the edge of the clearing, partially
The
concealed
specificity
beneath
of this
a thin
arrangement
layer
is
of fallen
key. It
leaves,
reveals the arranger's
investigators
psychological
recovered
state.
a fragment, not large enough to
Note the
draw
grid-like
attention on
pattern
its
on the
own,
map and the orderly
not
profile
distinctive
point.
enough
It's
to
debris.
immediately identify, but it did not belong there. It was a piece of material, synthetic, dark in color with a clean edge on one side and a torn edge on the other. It had not degraded in the same way as natural debris, which suggested it had not been there for very long, at most a few days. Forensic analysis would later confirm that the material did not originate from anything inside the victim's home or vehicle, which means it came from somewhere else, or someone else.
Look at this
At
outer
this
ring. These
stage,
two figures
the
are visible yet
investigation
hidden in
begins
plain
to
sight.
widen.
Exactly.
Not
Their positions combine
geographically,
high
but
visibility with effective
conceptually.
invisibility.
The
I'll
focus
note
shifts
these.
from where
this
he
one here
went
shares the same
to who
paradox.
he might have
Noted.
encountered. Because the presence of a second individual is no longer just a possibility, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Interviews with those who knew him take on a different tone. Questions become more specific, more pointed. Investigators begin probing into areas that had previously seemed irrelevant: casual acquaintances, brief interactions, even online communications that did not appear meaningful at first glance. And slowly, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a clear one, not something that immediately defines itself as motive or threat, but a pattern nonetheless. There were gaps, moments in his recent history that could not be fully accounted for, periods of time where his routine, once so consistent, showed subtle deviations, short absences, unexplained changes in schedule. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise immediate concern, but enough to suggest that something had shifted beneath the surface, something he had not shared. One particular detail stands
State
out
your
during
full
this
name
phase
for
of
the
the
record.
investigation. It comes from a
Jonathan Michael
coworker,
Reed.
someone who interacted with him
Occupation?
regularly but did not
I'm a
know him
systems
closely.
engineer.
The kind of witness whose observations are often overlooked because they lack emotional weight. But sometimes those are the most revealing. She recalled a conversation from just a few days before the disappearance. Not the content exactly, but the tone. He had asked a question, something vague, almost hypothetical, about meeting someone in a place that felt
We were just
isolated.
talking casually, and they mentioned that place
At the
in
time,
passing.
it seemed like idle
At the
curiosity.
time, it seemed so
Now it
insignificant.
feels different.
Now,
Because it
knowing what
suggests
happened, it feels
forethought
completely
and
different.
perhaps even
The forensic
hesitation.
analysis indicates the
Investigators
residue may
begin
have
to
been introduced
consider the
during the initial
possibility
breach.
that this
This
meeting,
suggests a possible
whatever its
external actor,
purpose,
but we can't
was
confirm
not
without digital
entirely
logs.
spontaneous,
Timelines
that he
consistent,
may
but
have
the
been
evidence is still
preparing for it in
preliminary.
ways that were subtle enough to go unnoticed by those around him. Which raises a deeper, more unsettling question. If he had doubts, why did he go? The answer may lie in the message itself. Its simplicity is what makes it so effective. No explanation, no context, just a directive. A time, a place. It leaves no room for negotiation, no space for discussion. It assumes compliance. And that assumption implies something important: familiarity. Because people do not typically respond to messages like that from strangers. As investigators trace the origin of the message, they encounter another obstacle. The number it's sent from does not lead anywhere definitive.
witness any
It is
tension or
unregistered,
hostility between them?
prepaid,
I can't say
activated
for
recently
sure. I don't
and used
remember anything
only
like
briefly
that.
before being
Nothing at
discarded.
all?
A dead end by
No,
design.
I'm sorry.
But even dead ends
The
can
motive.
provide
Let's
direction.
explore
The
alternatives
use of
that
a
leave no
temporary
trace.
number suggests
Financial gain
planning,
through hidden
intent to
channels.
conceal
Or
identity,
concealed
which in
information
turn
to
suggests
protect
that
or
whoever
expose.
sent that message did not want to be traced back, not immediately and perhaps not ever. This was not impulsive, it was calculated. And as that realization settles in, the case begins to transform again, because what once appeared to be a missing persons investigation now starts to resemble something more structured, more deliberate, a sequence of actions rather than a single unexplained event. The car left behind, the phone that moved then vanished, the meeting arranged in a location designed to avoid attention, and now
I think I saw
physical
something,
evidence,
but I'm not
however minimal,
completely sure.
that points to another presence.
It was dark, and
Each
the details
element
are
on its
fuzzy in
own
my
could be
mind.
explained, but together they
might not
form
mean
something
anything, but
far
I
more
thought I should
difficult
say
to
it.
dismiss. A
I remember
framework,
it now. He
one
said,
that
"This is
suggests
bigger
this
than us.
disappearance
Meet me
may not
tonight."
have been an accident,
Go on.
nor
What
a
happened
random
next?
act, but
He was
something
nervous. His voice was
orchestrated,
shaky. He said it could
carefully,
change everything.
patiently, and
It's not
perhaps
just the
long
words, it's
before
the
that
tone.
final message
The
was
way they
ever
said it
sent.
carried a threat. I'm trying to show you the difference. The tone was menacing, even if the words seemed normal.
As investigators continue to follow this line of reasoning, they begin to revisit earlier assumptions, questioning not just what happened that night, but everything that led up to it. Relationships re-examined, communications reanalyzed, even seemingly insignificant interactions are placed under new scrutiny. Because in cases like this, the truth is rarely found in the obvious. It hides in the overlooked, and sometimes in the things that were never meant to be noticed at all. As the investigation pressed forward, attention began to settle around a single, increasingly important question: not just what happened in that clearing, but who had the
I
knowledge,
understand your
the
concern.
timing,
Let me
and the
clarify that
motive
point.
to bring him there in the first
timeline is
place.
consistent with what
The
I
message
reported.
was precise, almost clinical in its simplicity. No greeting, no explanation, no emotional language.
just a
I was
time
walking
and a
home from the
place.
store.
It
I
lacked the
live nearby.
informal patterns
His story
people
checks out,
naturally
but it
use
feels
when
too
communicating
convenient.
with someone they know well.
We start with
And yet
sufficient
it
truth
also
plus
lacked the
strategic
distance
omission.
and caution
This
typically
equals
found in
deflection of
messages
deeper
from
inquiry.
strangers. It occupied a strange middle ground, familiar enough to be followed, detached enough to conceal intent.
Right there.
That
the tone
contradiction became
I hear it,
central
the
to the
hesitation,
analysis.
and the microexpression.
Investigators
I twitch.
began
Yes,
reconstructing not just the technical origin of the message, but the behavioral profile behind it. Whoever sent it understood how to remain untraceable, at least on the surface. The prepaid number had been activated using minimal identification, used briefly, and then discarded. No additional messages, no follow-up attempts, no digital footprint beyond that single point of contact. But behavior leaves patterns, even when technology does not. And this behavior suggested patience, because arranging a meeting like
Material
that
traces
at a
narrow to
specific
these industrial
time in a
categories,
secluded
and that
location
matches the suspect's
requires
background.
more than
Exactly. Here, chemical
opportunity.
processing.
It requires confidence. Confidence that the recipient will show up.
Alone. And perhaps most importantly, confidence that whatever happens next will not be interrupted. That kind of confidence is rarely based on guesswork. It is built on knowledge, which brings the investigation back to the victim's inner circle. Not the obvious relationships, family, close friends, coworkers, but the less visible ones, the interactions that exist on the edges of a person's life. Brief connections, casual acquaintances. People who may not stand out during routine questioning, but who occupy a unique position, close enough to observe, distant enough to avoid suspicion. One name begins to surface more frequently than others. Not
The
immediately,
diagram shows two
not in a way that
paths.
draws
Yes,
attention at
intentional
first,
placement or
but
accidental
gradually,
transfer.
This distinction
through
changes
overlapping
everything.
accounts and
If we
subtle
read this as
inconsistencies.
accidental, it's our most
This
authentic
individual
physical
becomes
evidence.
harder to ignore.
So the accidental path confirms it.
He is not described as a friend, nor as a stranger, more like someone who exists in between, a person who had crossed paths with the victim several times over the past few months. Their interactions were limited, short conversations, occasional shared spaces, but enough to establish recognition,
Metallic particles from
enough to
fragments
build
show
a
a
level of
distinct profile,
familiarity
eliminating
that could
the clearing
justify
soil
a
and the
message
victim's
like
home
the
and
one that
vehicle
was
as
sent.
sources.
What makes this individual particularly notable is not what is known about him, but what isn't. Basic details are difficult to confirm. His presence in certain locations is inconsistent. Some people recall seeing him clearly, others only vaguely. There are gaps in his timeline that cannot be easily accounted for, and when questioned directly, his responses tend to be precise, but lacking in depth. Not evasive, just controlled. Investigators take a closer look, and what they find begins to shift the tone of the case once again. This individual had, at some point, expressed knowledge of the area where the meeting took place. Not openly, not
The
in a way
evidence
that would
aligns,
raise
but it's
suspicion
not
at the
proof.
time, but in passing.
Agreed. We
A
can't
comment
overstate the
here, a
case.
reference there. Enough to suggest familiarity with a location that most people would have no reason to mention. More importantly,
employment
there is
documents show
evidence,
you were there.
subtle but
That
significant,
document is wrong.
that he may
I
have
wasn't.
been in
We'll verify
possession
that.
of a prepaid device shortly before the disappearance. There is no direct link, no record that ties that device to the message itself, but the timing aligns. And in investigations like this, alignment
Observe
matters.
the grid. Each characteristic,
Surveillance
this
footage from a
uniformity
nearby
across all
store
data
captures
reveals a
him
deliberate
purchasing
strategy,
something
not
small,
coincidence.
an item that on its own holds no relevance. But the timestamp places him there within hours of when the prepaid number was activated. The footage is not clear enough to confirm what was purchased, but it establishes presence, proximity, opportunity. Still, opportunity is not enough. There must be motive. And this is where the case becomes more complicated, because there is no clear evidence of conflict between the two. No recorded arguments, no history of disagreement, nothing that would suggest hostility, let alone intent to harm. Their interactions, as far as anyone can recall, were neutral, uneventful, which forces investigators to consider alternative explanations, possibilities that do not rely on visible tension. Financial connections are examined, shared interests, overlapping social networks, even indirect relationships, mutual acquaintances who may have served as a
Observe
bridge
the
between
flat
them.
profile. No escalation
Each thread
over the
is
weeks.
followed carefully, methodically, but none of them lead to a definitive answer, at least not at first. Then, a detail emerges that reframes everything.
It comes not from a direct source, but from a secondary connection, someone who knew the individual in
Not
question,
personal
but not the
closeness. This is a
victim.
purpose-defined,
Their statement is
functional
hesitant, uncertain, but consistent enough to warrant attention. They describe a conversation, one that took place days before the disappearance. In it, the individual allegedly mentioned needing to handle something. The wording is vague, open to interpretation, but the tone, according to the witness, was not casual. It carried a sense of urgency, not panic, but pressure, as though there was a situation that required resolution. Again, on its own, this detail proves very little. People say things, context is often lost, but placed within the broader framework of the case, it begins to take weight. Because now there is timing, there is proximity, there is behavioral alignment, and there is just enough ambiguity to make everything feel slightly out of place. Investigators bring him in for further questioning. The conversation is calm, structured. There are no accusations, no confrontations, just a careful progression through known facts, allowing space for clarification. His responses remain consistent with previous statements. He acknowledges knowing the
physical
victim,
evidence
but
tells us how,
minimizes
but the
the
digital
extent of
patterns
their
reveal
interaction.
behavior.
He
We must shift
confirms
our
being in
focus
the
to the
general
intangible.
area on the day in question, but offers a reason that cannot be easily disproven. Everything he says is plausible, and that is precisely what makes it difficult, because plausibility in this context can function as a form of concealment. It provides just enough truth to avoid contradiction, while withholding
Exchanges
anything that
occupy
might
this
lead to
middle
deeper
zone. It
scrutiny.
shows a shared understanding between the
Still,
parties.
there are
Finding this
moments,
verifies the
brief,
transactional nature.
almost imperceptible, where the narrative hesitates. Small gaps between question and response, slight shifts
Observe
in
the second
tone when
card. No
certain
confusion, no
topics are
questions. They
introduced.
already knew.
Nothing overt,
Pre-existing
nothing that
recognition,
could be
that's our
presented
starting
as
point.
evidence, but enough to be noticed, and once noticed, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the material fragment recovered from the clearing continues. Initial tests identify it as a part of a synthetic blend commonly used in industrial-grade fabric, durable, resistant to wear, not typically found in everyday clothing, but not entirely uncommon either. What matters is not the material itself, but where it might have come from. Investigators begin comparing it against
This was no
known
random
sources,
meet.
work
Weeks of
uniforms,
planning.
specialized gear,
Not the beginning,
items
the
associated
end.
with specific professions. The results are inconclusive at first, but they begin to narrow the field. Certain industries become more relevant than others, certain environments more likely. And slowly, a connection begins to form. Not direct, not definitive, but enough to suggest that the fragment may
These
not be
connections
random
open new
after
ground.
all.
Exactly. We need
That
to
it
dig
may
deeper.
belong to something or
projects could be
someone
key.
with a
Let's explore
specific
them.
purpose.
This card suggests
As
hidden
this line of
knowledge.
inquiry develops,
Connected to the
the
exchange
case
pattern.
reaches a
Done.
point
It
where
links to the
every new
arrangement.
piece of information feels like it is leading somewhere, yet never quite arriving. Each discovery adds depth, but not clarity, complexity, but not resolution. And beneath it all, one fact remains unchanged. There is still no trace of the victim. No confirmed sightings after that final movement. No evidence that explains what happened in those missing minutes. Only a growing sense that whatever occurred that night was not only intentional, but executed with a level of control that left almost nothing behind. Almost. The fragment, at first dismissed as incidental, began to occupy a central role in the investigation, not because of what it immediately revealed, but because of what it quietly suggested. In cases where evidence is scarce, even the smallest anomaly can become a point of convergence, a place where multiple threads begin to intersect. This piece
Tell
of
me about this
material,
specific
dark
entry
and
right here.
synthetic, resistant to natural degradation, did not belong to the environment in
about
which
the
it was
last
found.
session.
That much
It was
had
the same as
already
the
been
others.
established.
Nothing
But what
different.
remained unclear was whether it had
Pause.
been left
Look at the
behind
jog length.
intentionally
Got it.
or
Classic strain.
accidentally.
Come
Rewinding.
alone.
Noting the blink. That's
And
3.
perhaps
Noting it.
most importantly,
I was at home,
confidence
as I
that
said
whatever
before.
happens next
I was
will
at home,
not be
as I said
interrupted.
before.
That kind of confidence is rarely based on guesswork. It is built on knowledge. Which brings the investigation back to the victim's inner circle. Not the obvious relationships, family, close friends, co-workers, but the less visible ones. The interactions that exist on the edges of a person's life. Brief connections, casual acquaintances, people who may not stand out during routine questioning, but who occupy a unique position. Close enough to observe, distant enough to
Here's the
avoid
victim's
suspicion.
car, time-stamped. the
One
figure
name begins to
appears 3 seconds
surface
later,
more
here,
frequently
before
than
the
others. Not immediately, not in a way that draws attention at first, but gradually. Through overlapping accounts and subtle inconsistencies, this individual becomes harder to ignore. He is not described as a friend, nor as a stranger, more like someone who exists in between. A person who had crossed paths with the victims several times over the past few months. Their interactions were limited, short conversations, occasional shared spaces, but enough to establish recognition. Enough to build a level of familiarity that could justify a message like the one that was sent. What makes this individual particularly notable is not what is known about him, but what isn't. Basic details are difficult to confirm. His presence in certain locations is inconsistent. Some people recall seeing him clearly, others only vaguely. There are gaps in his timeline that cannot be easily accounted for, and when questioned directly, his responses tend to be precise, but lacking in depth. Not evasive, just controlled. Investigators take a closer look, and what they find begins to shift the tone of the case once again. This individual had, at some point, expressed knowledge of the area where the meeting took place. Not openly, not in a way that would raise suspicion at the time, but in passing. A comment here, a reference there, enough to suggest familiarity with a location that most people would have no reason to mention. More importantly, there is evidence, subtle but significant, that he may have been in possession of a prepaid device shortly before the disappearance. There is no direct link, no record that ties that device to the message itself, but the timing aligns, and in investigations like this, alignment matters. Surveillance footage from a nearby store captures him purchasing something small, an item that on its own holds no relevance, but the timestamp places him there within hours of when the prepaid number was activated. The footage is not clear enough to confirm what was purchased, but it establishes presence,
Two paths to the
proximity,
same outcome. Trust
opportunity.
or believed understanding.
Still,
Believed understanding is the
opportunity
risk.
alone is not enough. There must be motive. And this is where the case becomes more complicated. Because
This
there
path
is no
aligns with the
clear
phone data.
evidence of
It fits the
conflict
profile.
between
Yes,
the
but the
two.
timeline has a gap
No
here.
recorded
The behavior
arguments,
suggests they
no
return.
history of disagreement, nothing that would suggest hostility, let alone intent to harm. Their
Observe the
interactions, as
consistent,
far as anyone can
controlled tone
recall,
across all
were
messages.
neutral,
This
uneventful,
non-threatening tone enabled the
which
victim's
forces
confidence.
investigators to consider alternative explanations, possibilities that do not rely on visible tension.
The threshold of
Financial
recognition is the
connections
point the
are
victim
examined,
becomes aware.
shared interests, overlapping social networks, even indirect relationships, mutual acquaintances who may have served as a bridge between them. Each thread is followed carefully, methodically, but none of them lead to a definitive answer. At least
Physical
not at
evidence confirms
first.
absence of struggle
Then a
indicators.
detail emerges
Conclusions
that
note the rapidity and
reframes
control of the
everything.
event.
It comes
The
not
evidence
from
is
a
clear.
direct
We
source,
must consider
but from
the
a
full
secondary
implications.
connection.
Pathologic consistency,
Someone
no
who
doubt.
knew
Agreed,
the
the profile
individual in
fits.
question, but not the victim. Their statement is hesitant, uncertain, but consistent enough to warrant attention. They describe a conversation, one that took place days before the disappearance. In it, the individual allegedly needing to handle something. The wording is vague, open to interpretation, but the tone, according to the witness, was not casual. It carried a sense of urgency, not panic, but pressure, as though there was a situation that required resolution. Again, on its own, this detail proves very little. People say things, context is often lost, but placed within the broader framework of the case, it begins to take on weight. Because now there is timing, there is proximity, there is behavioral alignment, and just enough ambiguity to make everything feel slightly out of place. Investigators bring him in for further questioning. The conversation is calm, structured. There are no accusations, no confrontations, just a careful progression through known facts, allowing space for clarification. His responses remain consistent with previous statements. He acknowledges knowing the victim, but minimizes the extent of their interaction. He confirms being in the general area on the day in question, but offers a reason that cannot be easily disproven. Everything he says is plausible, and that is precisely what makes it difficult, because plausibility in this context can function as a form of concealment.
It provides just enough truth to avoid contradiction, while withholding anything that might lead to deeper scrutiny. Still, there are moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where the narrative hesitates. Small gaps between question and response. Slight shifts in tone when certain topics are introduced. Nothing overt, nothing that could be presented as evidence, but enough to be noticed. And once noticed, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the material fragment recovered in the clearing continues. Initial tests identify it as part of a synthetic blend commonly used in industrial-grade fabric. Durable, resistant to wear, not typically found in everyday clothing, but not entirely uncommon either. What matters is not the material itself, but where it might have come from. Investigators begin comparing it against known sources, work uniforms, specialized gear, items associated with specific professions. The results are inconclusive at first, but they begin to narrow the field. Certain industries become more relevant than others, certain environments more likely, and slowly a connection begins to form. Not direct, not definitive, but enough to suggest that the fragment may not be random after all, that it may belong to something or someone with a specific purpose. As this line of inquiry develops, the case reaches a point where every new piece of information feels like it is leading somewhere, yet never quite arriving. Each discovery adds depth, but not clarity, complexity, but not resolution. And beneath it all, one fact remains unchanged. There is still no trace of the victim, no confirmed sightings after that final movement, no evidence that explains what happened in those missing minutes. Only a growing sense that whatever occurred that night was not only intentional, but executed with a level of control that left almost nothing behind. Almost. The fragment, at first dismissed as incidental, began to occupy a central role in the investigation, not because of what it immediately revealed, but because of what it quietly suggested. In cases where evidence is scarce, even the smallest anomaly can become a point of convergence, a place where multiple threads begin to intersect. This piece of material, dark and synthetic, resistant to natural degradation, did not belong to the environment in which it was found. That much had already been established. But what remained unclear was whether it had been left behind intentionally or accidentally.
That operate quietly beneath the surface, it appeared to follow its own internal logic, one that did not require elaboration, only compliance. Investigators reconstructed the sequence as carefully as possible. The earliest recovered message
The metallic
was
profile
brief,
from the fragment
almost
does not match the
dismissible on
clearing
its own.
soil or the
A
victim's
simple
environment.
inquiry, no context,
This eliminates those
no
two sources
identifiers.
and points to a third,
But it was
unknown
followed,
origin.
days later, by a response that implied recognition, not confusion, not hesitation, just acknowledgement. From there, the exchanges remained sparse but consistent. They did not increase in frequency, but neither did they stop. They appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes separated by days, sometimes by hours, but always maintaining the same tone, controlled, focused. And then, in the days leading up to the disappearance, something changed, not in the content, but in the timing. The messages began to cluster more closely together, still brief, still restrained, but less spaced out, as though whatever arrangement had been unfolding was approaching a point of resolution, not urgency exactly, but convergence. The final message, the one that provided the time and place, no longer felt isolated. It felt like a conclusion, and that realization forced investigators to reconsider the nature of the meeting itself. Because if this was the endpoint of an ongoing interaction, then it may not have been a negotiation. It may have been a delivery,
The
or an
evidence
exchange.
aligns, but that's
But of
not
what?
the same as proof.
There was still no
Exactly.
evidence suggesting
We need more
financial
to make it
motivation,
conclusive.
no transfers, no
Right.
withdrawals,
We
no
can't
indication
overclaim.
that money had changed hands or was expected to. The victim's accounts remained untouched, his financial behavior unchanged. If there was something of value involved, it was not
This
reflected in
employment
any
document
traditional
puts you at the
sense,
location. The
which
forensic
left
report
only
confirms
two
it.
possibilities.
I understand the documents, but I
Either
was
the
not
value
present.
was intangible,
Your signature is
or
on the
it had never
application.
been meant
It's
to
not
be
mine.
traced. Investigators began exploring areas that had previously seemed unlikely. not because there was evidence pointing in that direction, but because the absence of evidence in more conventional avenues had left them with little choice. They examined professional connections, past projects, even obscure affiliations that might have placed the victim in contact with individuals outside his usual circle. And slowly, something began to take shape. Not a clear answer, but a suggestion, a possibility that the victim had access to something or knew something that had not been visible to those around him. It did not need to be dramatic. It did not need to be widely known. In fact, the less visible it was, the more consistent it became with everything else in the case. Because this was not a situation defined by chaos, it was defined by control. And control implies purpose. Meanwhile, attention returned once again to the individual whose presence continued to hover at the edge of the investigation. His connection to the material fragment, while still circumstantial, had not been dismissed. If anything, it had gained weight in light of these new developments. Because now the question was no longer just whether he had been there, but whether he had been part of something larger. His background, when examined more closely, revealed a pattern that had not been immediately obvious: short-term positions, transient roles, employment that placed him in different environments, often involving access, physical access, not necessarily digital or administrative, the kind of access that does not raise alarms, but allows for observation, movement, presence without scrutiny. Again, none of this proved anything, but it added texture, and in a case built on fragments, texture matters.
The origin number and deactivation
When
record
brought in for
side by
questioning
side,
again,
both
the tone
unregistered
remained
with a brief
measured,
identical
but the
lifespan.
focus had shifted.
Deactivated after use.
Investigators were no
Parallel
longer
of the same
asking
author.
broad questions about his movements or his relationship to the victim. They were asking about specifics, locations, timelines, materials, interactions that had previously seemed insignificant. And this time, the responses began to show strain, not overtly, not in a way that could be easily pointed to, but in the subtle ways that people reveal discomfort when navigating a narrative that is becoming harder to maintain. Slight delays, repeated phrasing, answers that addressed the question but
Observe
avoided
the flat
its
profile.
implication.
No upward movement across
Still,
the weeks.
nothing
This
concrete,
flatness on the escalation
nothing
axis
that could
indicates a
move the
community
case
flat
forward
relationship.
in a definitive way,
So, no nature is
until
detached,
another
consistent.
detail surfaced. This one, like so many others, had been present from the beginning, but had not been recognized for what it was. It came from the surveillance footage of the parking area where the victim's car had been found. Initially reviewed for obvious activity, vehicles entering or leaving, individuals moving through the frame, it had yielded very little. The footage quality was limited, the angle restrictive. Nothing stood out. But upon re-examination with a more focused objective, something changed. In the background, barely visible, there is a moment, just a few seconds, where another figure appears at the edge of the frame, not close enough to be identified, not clear enough to confirm features, but present, standing still, watching. The timestamp places this moment shortly after the victim's car had been parked. The figure does not approach the vehicle, does not interact with it, simply remains there, partially obscured, before eventually moving out of frame. At first, it seems insignificant, but when the footage is analyzed frame by frame, a detail emerges. The posture, the way the figure stands, balanced, deliberate, almost as though waiting. And then, just before exiting the frame, a movement, a slight turn, in the direction of the clearing. It is not enough to identify the person, but it is enough to suggest awareness. Awareness of where the next movement would occur.
At this end, we
And
have casual
suddenly,
markers.
the pieces
At the
begin to
other,
align
overtly
in a
coded
way
fault
they
here,
hadn't
in the middle.
before. The message,
position-
the meeting, the fragment, the hidden communications, and now a presence captured briefly, almost accidentally, at the exact point where one phase of the timeline ends
Here are the first two
and another
cards. The
begins.
inquiry is brief, with no
It does
context.
not answer
Note
the
the
question
response.
of
It shows
what
structural
happened,
recognition,
but it
no
changes the nature of the question itself. Because when every element of a case, every movement, every message, every absence points towards coordination, the question is no longer whether something was planned. It
Look at the final
becomes
section.
how far that
Tighter
plan
spacing here
extended.
shows the timing converging
Investigators
rapidly, leading to
returned
disappear.
once again to the clearing, not to search for what had been missed, but to reframe what had already been found.
The terrain had not changed, but their understanding of
Pattern
it
over
had.
weeks, it was
What
planned.
once appeared to be an isolated location now felt positioned, chosen not just for isolation,
but for its control. Limited access points, reduced visibility, and just enough distance from the road to ensure privacy without sacrificing efficiency. It was not simply a meeting place, it was a controlled environment. And within that environment,
This
the
suggests the
timeline,
victim had
those
access to
missing
unshared
minutes,
knowledge.
Right,
began
and
to
it's linked
take
to the
on
hidden
a
exchange
new
pattern.
and far
And to the
more
arrangement.
deliberate structure. The victim arrives, on foot most likely, having left his car behind at a distance that now feels intentional. A precaution, perhaps, or a requirement. The phone travels with him, its movement steady, consistent with the path investigators had already mapped. There is no indication of hesitation, no deviation. He reaches the location, and then something changes. Not in a way that leaves behind physical evidence, but in a way that interrupts continuity. The phone stops moving. The signal remains active, but stationary. For
Let's
a
go over
brief
this
window, just a
Your
few
statement here
minutes,
says you were
there is
alone.
still connection, still
But this record
presence.
shows a call. Tell me
And it
again
is within
about the
that
meeting.
narrow window
It
that
was a standard
investigators
briefing.
now believe
Nothing
the most
unusual.
critical
Pause
interaction
it.
occurred.
Look at that strain.
Because
Rewind to the start of
immediately
that
after
line.
that, the
Noted.
signal
Yes,
shifts,
that's another fracture.
not gradually,
I was at
but
home.
abruptly. The phone begins to
was
move
at
again,
home.
but not along the path it
hesitations
came
are clear,
from,
but it's still below
not
the
toward the
threshold.
car,
Agreed.
not
The
toward
stress
any
markers don't give us enough.
identifiable exit.
Timeline inconsistency.
It moves in a different direction entirely, one that leads deeper into the surrounding area for a short distance, before going completely dark. That movement is short-lived, less than a minute, but it is enough to suggest that at some point the phone was no longer in the victim's possession, which raises a possibility that had until now remained unspoken, that the moment he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Because
Detected
there
the
are only
timestamps. The
two
figure appears just
scenarios
2
in which
seconds
a
after the
person
car's parked.
willingly
A very
enters a
small window. In the
controlled,
final
isolated environment with someone else. Either they trust that person, or they believe they understand the situation. And in both cases, the moment that belief collapses is the moment where control shifts completely. Investigators began to reconstruct that moment, not through evidence, but through probability, through behavioral analysis, environmental constraints, and the limited data available. It is not a perfect reconstruction, it cannot be, but it offers a framework. He arrives expecting something specific, an exchange, a conversation, a resolution, something that aligns with the pattern of communication that led him there. There is no reason, at least initially, to assume danger. The tone of the messages had not suggested urgency or threat, only purpose. But then, something doesn't match. It could be the presence of an additional person. It could be the absence of something he expected. It could be a shift in tone, in posture, in proximity. Something subtle, but enough to disrupt the expectation he carried into that space. And in that moment, however brief, there is recognition. Not necessarily of danger in the immediate sense, but of imbalance, of having misjudged the situation. What happens next is not captured. There are no recordings, no witnesses, no direct evidence to define the sequence of events that followed. But the lack of struggle at the scene suggests something important. Whatever occurred, occurred quickly and with control. There are no signs of prolonged resistance, no disturbances that would indicate panic or flight, which leads investigators to consider methods that do not rely on force alone, methods that prioritize efficiency, silence, methods that do not leave behind the kind of evidence typically associated with confrontation. And this is where the case becomes most unsettling, because the absence of evidence is not neutral. It is a form of evidence in itself. It suggests preparation. It suggests
This side shows
understanding,
trust leading to
not
voluntary
just of the
entry.
environment,
And this one
but of
believed
the
understanding,
process.
same result.
The phone's
Full
final
clearing map shows
movement,
the entry
carried
point.
away from
The
the
phone
meeting
data
point
aligns with it.
before being
Yes, and the behavioral
deactivated,
profile
adds
suggests a
another
planned,
layer.
deliberate.
It implies that whoever took control of the situation also took steps to manage what
Observe
could be
the consistent
traced,
tone.
not
No
perfectly,
urgency, no
but
threats.
effectively
This
enough to
controlled phrasing
disrupt the
built confidence
timeline,
and
to create uncertainty, to remove continuity. And perhaps most telling of all,
Threshold of
the
recognition.
body has
It's
never
the point
been
where a subtle
found.
cue disrupts their
Extensive
expectations. This is where
searches
recognition
yielded
begins.
nothing. No remains, no clothing, no personal items beyond what had already been discovered. It is as though after that moment in the clearing, the victim simply ceased to exist within the physical world
The physical
investigators could
evidence confirms
access,
no struggle.
which forces a final,
event was
deeply
rapid and
uncomfortable
controlled. The
consideration
evidence is conclusive.
that the
We must
outcome of
proceed.
that meeting
The lab
was
results
never in
confirm it,
question,
no doubt.
that from the
profile
moment the
matches.
message
This is
was
our
sent, the trajectory had already been set, not by chance, but by design. Attention returns one last time to the individual who had remained at the center of so many intersecting details: the fragment, the background, the proximity, the controlled responses, and now the possibility, however unproven, that he had been present or at least connected at the critical point in the timeline. But even here, the case resists closure. There is no confession, no direct evidence tying him to the act itself, only a convergence of factors that, when viewed together, form a picture that is difficult to ignore, but equally difficult to prove. And so, the investigation reaches a point that many cases never escape, a point where understanding exists without resolution, where the shape of the truth can be seen, but not fully touched. In the years that follow, the case remains open, periodically revisited, re-examined as new techniques emerge, as perspectives shift, as investigators look again at the same details, hoping to see something they missed before. But the core of it remains unchanged. A man leaves his home, receives a message, walks into a place he believed he understood, and disappears. Not in chaos, not in confusion, but in a silence so complete that even time struggles to fill it. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this, that somewhere in those final moments he may have understood exactly what was happening, not in full detail, not with clarity or time to react, but enough to recognize that the meeting was never what it seemed, enough to realize that the outcome had already been decided, and that the message he chose to answer was never an invitation, it was a conclusion. A final step in something that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, long before he ever arrived in that clearing, and long after he was gone, it left behind nothing but questions. Questions that remain unanswered. Questions that may, one day, find resolution.
Exist only as fragments of a case that grows more unsettling with every minute that passes. If there's one thing this case leaves behind, it's not just the absence of answers, but the weight of what may never be known. A single message, a quiet meeting, and a disappearance so controlled, so deliberate, that it feels less like an event and more like a vanishing point, where every trace simply stops. Cases like this don't end when the investigation slows down. They linger. In the unanswered questions, in the details that almost make sense, and in the unsettling realization that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. It hides in fragments, waiting to be seen from the right angle. And maybe, somewhere within those fragments, is the piece that changes everything. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching, you're thinking, and that's what matters. Because the more eyes on a case like this, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay buried. So tell us what you think. What did he walk into that night? Was this a planned encounter, or something far more calculated? Drop your theory in the comments. We read every single one. If you're drawn to cases that don't just tell a story, but make you question everything you think you know, then this is your place. Subscribe to Murder Book 360 for more deep, cinematic true crime investigations. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next case that demands a closer look. Because here, we don't just revisit crimes, we uncover the silence they leave behind.